Well, good evening, good day, or whatever time zone you might be in. Welcome to another RBS talk. This evening, we talk to Professor Richard Robertson, and we'll be talking a bit about the Soufriere volcano here in St. Vincent. So, if you're joining us around the world, we welcome you, and let me thank you for joining us this evening. Local time here in St. Vincent, 4 minutes after 8 p.m. So, Professor Robinson, let me welcome you. Good to have you.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
All right. And tell us a bit about yourself. You've intention, that much I know, but you were born in St. Vincent. Where in St. Vincent are you from?
Well, I was born in Barley. My parents are either from Barley or from Rosal, which is not Leeward. And I spent about 7 years in Barley. Then we moved to Kingstown. We used to live in Montrose. And we used to live in Kingston Park, then Montrose, then Prospect, then latterly we lived in Vermont. And then for the past since '93, I've been in Trinidad working at Seismic.
Okay, so 93. Where were you on 1979 or last eruption?
Right. Well, that's actually interesting in terms of where I am now, because I actually was at the time would have been in sixth form, and so I was in upper six, I think. And so when the eruption happened, we were one of the schools that were closed down because grammar school became an evacuation shelter. So I was in grammar school, mainly an art student. Actually, in those days they had an art stream, science stream. So and it's the eruption is actually that led me to kind of what I'm doing now, because I then decided to become a geologist, more or less, and one specialized in volcanoes.
I figure that much because it has to be a volcano or recent eruption that prompted you to take the road that you're on presently. Okay, so you're here in St. Vincent. I know you are from, well, you're based in Trinidad, the Seismic Resource Center, UWI, that is. Tell us a bit, what is the responsibility of the seismic unit there in Trinidad as it relates to volcanoes in the region?
Yeah. Well, the Seismic Research Centre is the agency, the regional agency that's responsible for monitoring earthquakes and volcanoes. We also contribute towards the effort to monitor tsunamis, but essentially we are a regional agency that functions in each island either as a volcano monitoring agency, or essentially monitoring your own volcano, but it's in Vincent or Grenada, wherever it is, but also in other territories we actually deal with earthquakes, so we monitor tectonic earthquakes. In the case of St. Vincent, we do volcanoes and earthquakes. And we also, because we have lots of people who are geoscientists and who are people who are very knowledgeable about volcanoes and earthquakes, and also because tsunamis really are created to a large extent, two main causes are volcanoes and earthquakes. We also have some expertise in that area, and we provide some guidance on that. But really, mainly volcanoes and earthquakes in the Eastern Caribbean, the English-speaking Eastern Caribbean, that's our responsibility.
Okay. Take, for example, St. Vincent. We have a volcano. We have earthquakes every now and again. How that information get to you in Trinidad?
Well, the way in which it works is that we are based in Trinidad for various historical reasons, but the data from the islands, we have sensors or points in the islands which collect information about what the Earth is doing. Essentially, it either looks for ground shaking, which are usually related to plate movements or related to volcanoes becoming restless, as well as we have sensors that look at the deformation of the ground, again related to earthquakes and volcanoes. And we also do some observations as well as looking at areas which emit gases. But all that information and data, certainly in real time, the earthquake data comes directly to Trinidad at the center, where we have data processors that look at the data and scientists that look at it and interpret it. So the data varies through various technological means, either through radio waves or through satellite or through the regular internet, different forms of internet. We get into Trinidad, we look at it, and based on what we're seeing, we make prognosis, we provide information to governments, in terms of what we think is happening either with their volcanoes or with earthquakes, and for them to take action to minimize the potential impact they can have on people.
Okay, interesting. So here in St. Vincent, I'm sure that we might have a number station that was set up after or before the 79 eruption. Confirm that?
Yeah, I mean, and you have to bear in mind that from 79 and from the time that we first started to monitor earthquakes and volcanoes, which was sort of in late 50s, the technology has moved on. So prior to 79, there were seismic stations here. In fact, the monitoring network would have been sort of beefed up because of the 71, 72 activity. So we've always had seismic stations here since then, and particularly since 79 and even before 79, this was always a place that was kept a close eye on by seismic, because prior to say Soufriere Hills, Montserrat, it was the most active volcano in the Eastern Caribbean.
So any of these seismic stations here in St. Vincent, did they send you any information confirming that we have advanced activity or more than ordinary activity at the moment? Did any of these instruments send you that sort of information?
Yes, it did. But in terms of the precursory activity, Soufriere tends to move very fast from not doing very much to sort of eruption in a very short time. So really, definitively, we didn't know something for sure was happening until I think it started on Good Friday morning, early, and the scientists at Seismic didn't know for sure something was really, really unusual and potentially eruptive until Thursday afternoon. That's when seismicity picked up. Of course, they had periods before, because you had moved out of 71, 72, when you had PROSA monitoring. They had periods when you had elevated seismicity, but really, in terms of knowing for sure that something looked very likely, I think it was Thursday evening. It actually was just, I would say, fortuitous, because on Thursday evening at Seismic, in those days, the scientists would have a cricket match. They would play cricket and they would get together. And it happened that on that Thursday evening, they were having that. And it meant that people were physically at Seismic for longer than normal. And therefore, when they were playing, every now and then they would, go inside and they check. In those days, they used drum recorders and they would check the drums. And they started to see that something was happening in the drums. And then from that, it escalated as it became more and more. By 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, they realized something was happening. I think at some point during the night, they would have called the authorities and tell them that, something looked like it's happening. And by the next morning, it was actually explosively erupted. So it moves, sometimes Soufriere moves very fast. And that's why when things happen, we try to respond quickly. But yes, there were signs, but not very much period before that was clear that something was about to happen.
Tell us about the event that occurred recently, late December, regarding La Soufriere volcano here in St. Vincent. And I'm quite sure you have maybe some information from these equipment that was set up. Tell us a bit what happened, what occurred, so we could have an idea as to how these instruments tell you what is happening right now in St. Vincent.
Right. Yeah. Well, again, there's two things. I said that Soufriere moves fast, and in the past, it moves fast here, and sometimes, especially in these kinds of eruptions, it moves very quietly. In this case, I believe it would have been in November or so, and even before that, we have had periods, as I said, when you have uptick in seismicity and then it goes back. November was a period like that. They had a slight uptick, and we had been talking to Nemo that this is a little bit different, but really we didn't actually know something was clearly happening until I believe it would have been the Saturday of the weekend. That then on Sunday we realized we very well on Sunday we realized that, and how we determined that not from seismicity, quiet earthquakes. We weren't having very much earthquakes. I said there was a build up slightly in November. It had calmed down and it was quiet generally by the time it got to December. And the first indication that something was clearly or might have happened was on Sunday, when, because of the fact that one of our members of staff monitor a particular satellite alert that comes out of NASA, which monitors for hotspots, he got an alert that there was a hotspot over the volcano. And from then, we started to communicate to NEMO with the Soufriere monitoring unit, telling them that we need to check this out. Basically, what the indications from the satellite was that there was an area over the Soufriere that in the equator that was particularly hot. It could have been a forest fire, it could have been something else. So we needed somebody to verify. And they were about to verify that. Well, I believe it would have been the Monday or the Tuesday. I think they went up on the Tuesday. On the Monday, we got reports from someone in Rosal that the mountain was basically puffing. It was emitting some steam, which was again another unusual sign. Of course, all this time we haven't had an uptick in seismicity. Seismicity quiet. Earthquakes are still non-existent virtually. And then by Tuesday, a team from the Soufriere monitoring unit, I believe it was Tuesday or Wednesday, they went up and they actually saw a dome had grown. In checking back their records, it seemed that it must have come up sometime on early in the afternoon, afternoon of Sunday evening, and it moved progressively from breaking the surface to growing a lava dome effusively over the next, until we are here now, where it's grown to be much bigger than it was then, and continue to grow. We continue not to have very much earthquakes. We do have some earthquakes now, but not as much as one would expect. That's why one of the things that we're doing is putting in more stations that are closer to the volcano, closer to the source of emission. And we think if we are close enough in, maybe we start to detect some of the signals that will tell us, that it's continuing to grow, but also help us to gauge if or when it will go to a different stage, because we tend to have two different kinds of eruptions.
Okay, we want to talk a bit about what's happening at the volcano, but just before we go, I don't know if we could just dive in a bit more in the technical aspect of how this station that you set up, well, these recent station that you set up since you came here in St. Vincent, how do they operate? How do they send a signal to you? Is via the internet, via VHF, UHF, or satellite? Give us some information.
Right. So what we're doing now is that, and what normally happens when you put stations out in the field, and since we've been here, we put stations in new stations in Georgetown. We've re-established one in Wallabu, which is about 130 up the mountain of the volcano. We've put stations in Ovia. We had one there many years ago, and we have just begun to re-establish a station in Fancy. Now, what we are utilizing with these stations is we're using various means. One main one is using radio waves to move from the station to link into the fiber optic cable that the government system utilizes to link all the departments. We're linking into that, and once we linked onto that, we then get the signal transmitted to Trinidad directly. In the end, that's what we'll continue to do. But once we've got all the networks in place, what we will do is that we would bring all those signals to Belmont Observatory, and that would be the first point, as the data collecting point to a large extent. And we'll duplicate that. We send that at the same time to Trinidad, because as activity progresses, if it continues, we'll have to have established here an ongoing, essentially, group of people that would monitor what's going on. We'll have to activate the observatory, which is the Belmont. In Belmont, there's a building that was custom made after '79, where the scientific staff who are monitoring the volcano would be set up. So we're currently sort of refurbishing that, and that's where they will be based, and therefore that's where the data would come from all of these various points. Now, one of the other things we'll do, in addition to using fiber optic cables, we'll also probably build some redundancy into the system by using regular internet. And one of the other things that we do, one of the stations, at least one of these stations, is one that uses satellite. The one at Belmont actually uses satellite to send the data to Trinidad. Because one of the things that we do, we use different techniques and to try to build redundancy into the mechanism by which we bring data from the field to a collecting point and send it on to Trinidad. And that's generally how we operate, and that's how we would operate here in this.
Right. I was just reading the release a short while ago that was released by NEMO, and said that you have completed one in Ovia and also you started one Fancy today.
Yeah.
So these stations, they all communicate on different frequencies, I would want to believe.
Well, then most of them are IP, using IP radios. We use links into it through essentially it's IP radios using that sort of internet technology to transmit. They don't necessarily use regular radio frequencies. There's IP radios, so they use that methodology to link into the government backbone.
Okay.
But in the past, we have used radios with different frequencies that are we would have cleared with the National Telecommunications Authority. In the past, when we used to use RF, VHF radios, to try to get the signals from far point. But increasingly, what we do is essentially find a way to get into the internet, various types of internet, either it is broadband through flow and digital and things like that, or in this case by the pipeline. And then we use that. Once it gets onto that internet link, we could log into that from wherever it is and send the signal wherever we need to send it.
Okay, good stuff. I must apologize for diving into the technical aspect, but I'm a bit technical, and sometimes I wonder how these things operate. Tell us now what's happening in St. Vincent. You're manning the team. I know you have you went up with some aerial observation today using the helicopter that was provided out of Martinique, I believe.
Well, this one is actually from Antigua, and it's been provided through support from at Sedima, got from funding from the British government.
Okay,
the Martinique one would probably come back sometime.
Okay. So basically, what's happening here in St. Vincent? Right. Tell us what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, essentially what we do is monitoring a volcano, and monitoring a volcano, especially when it's in eruption, means that the scientific team have to have a presence in Ireland. That's why we have a small team here. But this small team is part of a larger team. So we have people in Trinidad, and we also have collaborators in Montserrat, and in fact, wider field. That's discussing all of the data that's coming, discussing what's happening, coming up with thinking up what might happen, what may not happen, how long it will take, that kind of thing, so that we could provide sort of the authorities with information that they need. But essentially what we do, we try to put in different stations to give us different kinds of data. One of the main ways in which we monitor volcanoes is by using earthquakes. Earthquakes tell us how the ground is shaking. And why we do that is because as magma comes out, the magma has to break the earth apart. It has to push fluids into the crust. And when it does that, it sets up vibrations that if we have seismometers at the summit, we can detect it. We can detect what is vibrations caused by fluid movement, like magma movement, or what is vibrations caused by rock breaking. So the nature of the signal itself tells us something about what the volcano is doing. So that's one of the main ways, seismometers and seismology to monitor what's happening. The other way in which we do it, sort of the main way, is to monitor for changes in shape. So the volcano sometimes essentially swells up, not in a way that you could see, but it what we call deforms, it changes its shape. So again, we put instruments on the mountain where we use global positioning system to precisely locate that point where that sensor is, where that receiver is. And what we hope, what we think, what we would expect is that as magma comes in and swells up the mountain, we will detect that, because we're trying to detect influx of magma underneath, because that is precursory to it coming out at the top, either explosively or effusively. And then the third thing that we do, increasingly, I will do that particularly now that we have the helicopter, because we have one expert from the Montserrat Volcano Observatory, a colleague of ours, Dr. Thomas Christopher, who is a member of staff at Seismic that works at the Montserrat Volcano Observatory. He's brought various techniques to monitor the output of gases, because the gases, again, tell us something about what kind of magma, how much gases the magma have, the kind of gas, because certain gases come from different parts of the system. So if we see a particular kind of gas, it tells us whether it's something that's coming from shallow versus something that's coming from deep. So gas is the other thing. And then, as you heard, the dome is growing. So one of the key things that we do is monitor for this change, the dome growth. And to do that, we use photogrammetry. Essentially, we take lots of pictures that are taken in particular ways. We know exactly the position of where the photograph is taken from. We take the picture and we compare successive periods of photographs taken from similar places. And by doing that, we could build, first of all, a model of the dome, how it shapes, and then we could see how that shape changes. And by measuring that, we could detect the rate at which it's changing, so therefore the rate of growth, and also we can measure the size increase, the volume. And that's important because in terms of this phase of the activity, one of the things that we're looking at in terms of just diffusion is, where is the diffusion going on? Where's the dome growing? Is it growing in an area that is going to spill over into the surrounding areas? Is it getting big enough that it's going to be able to chuck gas further afield? So just this growth itself is important. And then how it grows, rate at which it grows, where it grows will tell us something about what's the chances of something else happening. So the growth rate is a key thing, and the emission of gas is a key thing, and also the amount of earthquakes you have will tell us something. So all of these different techniques we use to try to build a picture of essentially what's happening under the ground, and that will tell us, based on the model we have of what we think the volcano is doing, what direction it will go in, because we're constantly trying to refine what we think is happening based on the data that's coming in, so that we could make an estimate of what's likely to happen, so that we could tell people.
All right, there's a question on the screen. I don't know if you want to take that one.
Well, one of the gases we monitor for is, in fact, sulfur, because the volcano produces a lot of sulfur. So we monitor for sulfur dioxide, hydrogen sulfide. Those are things that we monitor for. We use a technique that's called a multi-gas sensor, and we also use various techniques for monitoring for sulfur content. So sulfur is one of the key things that we monitor for, and in fact, one of the things that we'd expect, we can smell it. That's one of the things that Soufriere, in fact, the name Soufriere comes from the fact that these volcanoes in the region produce a lot of sulfur or sulfur compounds, and that's one of the things that we monitor for. Because again, it tells us something. You tend to find that different kind of sulfur species are associated with either a volcano that is erupting versus one that is not. So if people ever notice now, in the past, when you went up to Soufriere, you smelled a lot of rotten egg smell. That's hydrogen sulfide. That's usual for systems that's not really erupting. While now, if you go up now, if you were around now, you'll smell a lot more sulfur dioxide, which is indicative of a system that is erupting. That's fresh magma coming out. So those kinds of things we'd certainly be looking for.
Okay. The stage at well, I don't know how many information you have gathered so far. I was reading that the gases that were coming out were not steady; they were moving around, so you couldn't really get a good reading.
One of the challenges we have currently is that the gases come out, and they come out in something that we call a plume. If you think of a kettle, when the kettle boils, there's a plume that comes out of it, right? And it's usually in a kettle. It's a steady plume. You could see it coming out. In our case, because a lot of it isn't coming out, it's not a steady, it's not going up in the air and then curving over and then being blown by the wind. It's sort of coming out in little fits and puffs. So it's difficult to measure it, because what you really need, the way in which you measure it is essentially the plume comes up and then it curves over, and we put an instrument under it, and it uses UV radiation from the sun and the absorption rate of different sulfur species. As it comes out, we put the instrument underneath. We detect the plume content of sulfur based on that. So if the plume isn't strong and it's sort of floating about, it's difficult to get that measurement. So that's one of the challenges we have. So we have to find ways in which we could still detect it. So one of the things that we use is a multi-gas that would help us to know something about the content, but not necessarily anything about so much the flux, which is the rate at which it comes out. It tells us it's there, but it doesn't tell us the rate. So we use different techniques to try to know both the kind of gas and the rate at which it's coming out, because that's important in terms of telling us what the volcano is doing.
At this point, can you say from a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 being an explosion or explosive eruption, where do we stand, 1 to 10 at the moment?
Well, I think it's still too early to say. I would say that in the context of Soufriere tends to either erupt with effusive eruptions or it has explosions. And we'd expect that once you've had an effusive eruption, the next thing we would expect is an explosive eruption, because that's what it does. We now had a 79 eruption that happened, and then we now have this 2021 eruption that is both effusive. So I would guess that the next thing that we should have really some sort of explosive eruption. Now, it would not be, I'm more or less certain in the next couple of years, you're going to have some sort of explosive eruption at some point. Now, the question is it going to happen as part of this period, or is it going to have a break? We don't know that yet. We'll have to take a lot more measurements. That's one of the things we're looking for. So in terms of giving you sort of a straight answer on a scale of 1 to 10, we don't really know exactly when it's going to an explosive phase yet. That's why we need to have a lot more instruments in. We're still putting them in. We're still putting those in. But in an absolute sense, I would think that at some point in the future, because of the amount of effusive events you've had and the fact that you have gone through the effusive phase, it's more than likely you're going to have an explosive event at some point in the near future. I would be surprised if it continues to be effusive only for the foreseeable future, because of how it's always operated. There's no reason to think it's going to change now. It's just going to have effusive eruptions.
Well, I know it's hard to say, but how long do you think effusive eruption will go on for before?
Again,
I know it's hard to say.
Yeah, it's a good question. Again, I will go back to what is done historically. The effusive eruption in 1971-72, which was sort of the only thing that happened, went on for about a year around that time. It went from 71 to 72, a year plus or minus some. The 79 effusive event, which happens after an explosive event, went on for about 6 months. It went on. Might have been less than that, so a shorter period. So the one that happened after the explosive event happened for a shorter period, and the one that happened before an explosive event. So if you wanna unfortunately, that's the only two sort of clear data points we have, and that's difficult to make an estimate. I would say somewhere in between that. So it's probably going to be not as short as 2 or 3 months, but probably not as long as a whole year. So it's going to be somewhere between that, and it's always possible that you could stop, and then after that, after some break, or even continuing from the current period, you could go into some explosive phase.
Someone is asking a question. What about the cracks on the floor of the crater? What's causing it?
Right, I've heard about the cracks. I haven't really, I think people are referring to the video that's circulated. I haven't really looked at it carefully, but if there is, it would be unusual. If you think of it, what's happening, you had a crater floor that's made up essentially of loose material, but hardened material because it's been compacted over the years. What you have done is that you've now pushed something through it, right? As you push something through it, you're going to deform the crater floor. So it's not unusual for you to have fissures and cracks. In addition to which, remember the thing that we've seen at the top is the upper end of something that's coming from down below. So all that hot material at the top, there's even hotter material lower down, and all the gas that's coming from it is going to make its way to the surface. And in places where it's much more vigorous, it's going to open the surface, what people call a crack. So it's not unusual you're going to have cracks and fissures, both because of the stresses caused by the deformation of the ground, because material is coming in, and also simply because you have a greater influx of volcanic gases trying to get to the surface. So the ground around the dome is going to get hot. It's going to get gases coming through, hot gases, which are quite dangerous potentially. That's not unusual. That's kind of what you'd expect, given the fact that you have a mass of rock that's being in place, that's being oozing out of the ground, solid, and stressing the ground around it. You'd expect to see that happening. That's not unusual. That's kind of what you'd expect, given that an eruption is ongoing.
Okay, should we be concerned about the type of gases that's coming out of the volcano at present?
Yes, you should. You should for various reasons, because the gases, at least, they're very rich in sulfur. And they are things like hydrogen sulfide, sulfur dioxide, and then you have things like hydrogen chloride, hydrogen fluoride. Now, most of those, when they're in dilute concentrations, are not going to do you harm. I mean, when they get higher concentration, they're going to make it very difficult. The people who are particularly prone to certain respiratory problems are going to feel it first, but others are going to feel it. So those kinds of gases are potentially very corrosive. When they're in high concentrations, they're going to make it difficult to breathe, and really high concentration, they could be at harm. So fortunately, they get diluted, so when they get lower down the flanks, they are not concentrated enough to cause serious harm. But where they're coming from, in the crater, on the dome, on the crater rim, they could be quite high in concentrations, and they could overcome you. So those are the sulfur-rich gases, the hydrogen-rich gases, HCl, the caustic, what we call the halogens, the things that will smell like if you're drying out the back of your throat, and things that would smell like if you're smelling chlorine. Really, they burn your nose, that kind of thing. They will make it very uncomfortable. They could cause your system, your respiratory system, harm. But and we are still investigating it. But one of the things that we found today when we were flying around and we were checking the gas is that we also found that there was some carbon dioxide,
which is
that was
odorless.
being detected, right? Carbon dioxide, which is carbon dioxide is what we breathe out. So if you breathe in too much carbon dioxide, it's hard. And And if we, given where we were measuring, if we have in those concentrations there, we suspect that in the crater itself and on the crater rim, it's not going to be a good place. The challenge with carbon dioxide, though, is that it doesn't have any smell. So we're detecting it because we do instruments, but you can actually be up there with this carbon dioxide. If there's a pulse of carbon dioxide, which is rich in which you could have a pulse of gas, which is rich in carbon dioxide, and you could be in the crater rim or in the crater floor, and you don't know because you're not smelling it, and it would overcome you, and you would be. The first things that would happen is that you start sleeping because the carbon dioxide, you need oxygen, not carbon dioxide, to survive. So you go to sleep. Essentially, you would end up, if you get exposed to it too much, you can die, and you can die without you even knowing it.
How far would you say is a safe zone as it regards this gas?
Well, we still have to monitor its emission rate, but given what we are seeing, I would think certainly crater rim and the crater floor is one of the most dangerous places. We think as you get further afield, it starts wafting up, it gets mixing as you go further down. But a guide would be also to look at what the SO2 and the sulfur-rich gases, the acidic things, are doing with the vegetation. The chlorines are burning vegetation. So that tells you where the gases are getting, and one of the gases could be the carbon dioxide. The other thing too is that the carbon dioxide tends to be heavier. It sinks in depressions, in valleys. So one of the things that's will not be surprised is if in the crater itself, the concentrations of that in pockets will be much greater than higher up. So one of the most likely places for it to be in concentrations that could cause you harm is inside the crater itself.
Right. Let's put back this question on the screen.
Right. Yes. No, I would say it's a direct result, not so much of heat. It's a direct result of the high concentrations of hydrogen chloride in the atmosphere, and also the fact that essentially what happens is that the gas is mixed with the moisture and they form a dilute acid. So you're basically having a lot of acid burn, either from dilute hydrochloric acid, which is hydrogen sulfide, basically sulfur mixed with oxygen, with hydrogen, you have that. Remember I said you have hydrogen sulfide, you have sulfur dioxide, you have hydrogen chloride, hydrogen fluoride. All of these things become potentially damaging acids when you mix them with any moist conditions you have up there. So what you have is the vegetation being burnt, not in a physical sense, it's chemical burning because of the kind of gases that's coming out. Not so much the carbon dioxide, but more because of the sulfur and hydrogen-rich gases that are floating about there.
Okay, another question. What pushes magma to the surface?
To a large extent, it's driven by the amount of gas that is in it, and the extent to which the gas can come out of the magma easily or not. So a lot of what drives magmas to the surface has to do with the interaction and the amount of gas that you have in the magma, and what happens as it constantly is pushing it to the surface, because also magma generally tends to be more lighter than the surrounding rock, so there's a tendency to come out. But also the gases itself provides a driving force, because they're trying to, as they get close to the surface, the amount of gas that could stay in the chemical, in the crystal itself of the material, decreases as you get to the surface. So the gas essentially comes out as little bubbles, and that drives it up. They come out of solution. It helps the buoyancy of the magma as it gets up. So it has to do with the gases. It has to do with the viscosity or the stickiness, the amount of silica it has in it, and things like that interacting with the conditions beneath the crater. Is it an easy pathway, a difficult pathway? What is blocking it? What isn't? Determines where it comes out and how quickly it comes out of beneath the surface. But there is always a tendency. Magma, in a sense, always wants to get out, because it's what we call more buoyant than the surrounding rock. So therefore, there's always a tendency for it to push up to the surface, and it gets a little kick when it has a lot more gas in it that wants to come out of solution.
Okay, St. Vincent is basically between the Caribbean plate margin and the Atlantic plate margin.
Yeah, there's subduction happening. Yeah.
Right. What type of plate margin are we actually on? I know there are basically three types: some that pushes, some that moves apart, and some that slides.
Yeah. Well, this one is subduction. Basically, they're moving together, and one the Caribbean plate is dipping on the Atlantic plate, and as it dips under, it's creating a line of volcanoes that we live on. So it's a subduction zone, essentially.
Okay, is that the best plate to be living on?
But
We don't have a choice.
yeah, I don't think there's anything as a best plate. I think each of the plate margins, once you're in a plate margins, you're prone to earthquakes because the plates are not, they don't like interact with each other. They kind of get stuck, and when they get unstuck, they create earthquakes. So any kind of plate margin have different earthquakes. If they were moving apart, you'd have magmas coming up and more basaltic kind of emplacement of volcanic sort of most often submarine volcanoes. When they're moving together, you could either have subduction, which you have subduction zone volcanoes, or you could have fold mountains being created, which is earthquakes. When they're moving apart, they get stuck, and you could have strike slip faulting, and you have large earthquakes. So San Andreas, for example, in California, that's a strike slip fault, and that's where you have big earthquakes. So each of them have their own process. Subduction zone, of course, subduction zone volcanoes, unfortunately, are some of the most dangerous because they tend to produce magmas that are potentially very explosive. So I guess you could say that subduction zone volcanoes are not, subduction zones are not a nice place. But then we have these beautiful islands, so we can't complain. They're creating the islands that we live on. So you have to live with the good and the bad, in a sense.
I think we drop out there for a moment.
Yes,
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. I'm here.
I think we dropped out there for a while. So before we lose the internet, let's round this up. Tell us what are some of the things that we should be doing. If there's anything that you need to get out to the public, let's do that now before we lose the internet.
Yeah, I think we need to prepare. I keep saying we prepare for the worst and hope for the best, and the worst would be for it to go explosive. So we prepare for that. Depending on where you are in the island, you have to take certain kinds of action. You need to know whether you're in the red zone or the orange zone, which are the areas which you're most likely to have to be evacuated. So anybody in the flank of the volcano, Oria, Sandy Bay, all those areas, as far as Georgetown on one side and as far as Chateaubriand on the other side, you may have to move south to prepare for that possibility of that. Hope that doesn't happen. Listen to authorities' sources of information. We make a great effort at Seismic, at NEMO, to put information out to people. We're not hiding anything. I speak frankly to everybody about what's going on. We all do. We put a lot of information out. Listen to that information. Don't get carried away with things that people do or say. The volcano summit and the floor is a dangerous place to be right now. The rest of things, we could go about living our lives, but don't put yourselves in harm's way unnecessarily. Take preparations for what might happen. Listen to information and keep living your lives as normal. Given the covered environment in which we live in, you have to take those protocols. So I think that's what I'll say. People need to know that volcanoes are potentially dangerous things. They're beautiful landscapes, and that's why we live on the islands. We have St. Vincent volcano is one of the most majestic ones I find in the world. But when it's erupting, we have to be aware of that, and we take actions to minimize the impact it could have on us, our lives, and our nation. And if you do that, we're good.
All right. Well, let me thank you for your time. Thank you so much for being with us here this evening. And let me thank the Research Center in Trinidad for allowing us to speak to you as well. Couldn't do that without them. And let's hope that maybe sooner than later, we could do this again when you have the time. Let's keep in contact. I mean, folks are enjoying it, and it's very informative as they're saying. So let me thank you, and keep us posted.
Yes, certainly. I'm glad to be here anytime. As you said, one of the things we're trying to do is make sure people get the information from the horse's mouth, so to speak. So hopefully people have learned something tonight, and they keep listening to what's happening and be informed.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Roberts. And of course, folks, hope that you learned something, like the professor said. And we'll let you know when we'll have another live right here on RBS. We were live on RBS Facebook page, as well as on Gem Radio, as well as on Gem Radio 89.1 in the Marico Valley. Thank you for joining us, and let me thank the professor once again, and
All right.
have a great evening all.
Yeah. Okay. Bye-bye.
Wash your hand. Wash your hand. Wash your hand. Wash your hand. Granny said to wash your hand. Granny said to wash your hand. Before you sit at the table, wash your hand. Before you touch them utensils, wash your hand. Wash your hand.